I don't know if you want me to explain before and then count that as part of the reading, or just like start going, explain it, and read less of what I'm.
Well, I already started it.
Oh, well, in that case, so I'm reading an excerpt from The Fault in Our Stars. It's not the beginning, but what's happened to this point is that Augustus Waters and Hazel Grace, she's the main character, and it's told from her point of view. She's been invited over to this guy, Augustus Waters' house, to watch a movie, and they've literally just met that night at a support group for cancer, because he had cancer and was there with a friend who has like an eye cancer and has to get his like eye removed. And she's there because she has terminal lung cancer, and so she goes to this support group every once in a while. So this is the first time he's met her, and he invites her over to come watch this movie. And they've just met his parents, and now they're down in the basement in his room, and he's talking to her and finding out more about her, just because he's like enamored with her. And what I want to look over is like character motivation and kind of like their thoughts. And so he goes, and she goes, "Do you have siblings?" I asked. "Huh?" he answered, seeming a little distracted. "You said that thing about watching kids play." "Oh yeah, no, I have nephews from my half-sisters, but they're older." They're like, "Dad, how old are Julie and Martha?" And he's yelling from the basement, so just to like know the context. And he yells back, 28. They're like 28. They live in Chicago. They're both married to fancy lawyer dudes, or banker dudes. I can't remember. They both have siblings. "Do you have siblings?" I shook my head no. "So what's your story?" he asked, sitting down next to me at a safe distance. So he doesn't want to seem too forward, but he's safe distance. I already told you my story. I was diagnosed when, no, not your cancer story, your story. Interests, hobbies, passions, weird fetishes, etc. I said. "Don't tell me you're one of those people who becomes their disease. I know so many people like that. It's disheartening. Like, cancer is in the growth business, right? The taking people over business. But surely you haven't let it succeed prematurely." It occurred to me that perhaps I had. So she's wondering and, considering his kind of statement. I struggled with how to pitch myself to Augustus Waters, which enthusiasms to embrace, and in the silence that followed, it occurred to me that I wasn't very interesting. I am pretty unextraordinary. I reject that out of hand. Think of something you like. The first thing that comes to mind. Reading? What do you read? Everything. From, like, hideous romance to pretentious fiction to poetry, whatever. Do you write poetry too? No, I don't write. And then that exchange was a lot of back and forth without a he said or a she said, so that could be confusing to certain readers, but it was pretty much just he spoke and she spoke. You can follow it along, reading a little bit easier. And then he goes, "There," Augustus almost shouted. "Hazel Grace, you are the only teenager in America who prefers reading poetry to writing it. This tells me so much." And the question is, like, what? What does that tell him so much that she likes to read poetry as opposed to writing it? "You read a lot of capital G great books, don't you?" "I guess." "What's your favorite?" I said. My favorite book, by a wide margin, was An Imperial Affliction, but I didn't like to tell people about it. Sometimes you read a book and it fills you with this weird evangelical zeal, and you become convinced that the shattered world will never be put back together unless and until all living humans read that book. And so, big words there, evangelical zeal. Evangelical, like sharing, and then zeal, a lot of enthusiasm, if you're not familiar with the words. She continues thinking, "And then there are books like An Imperial Affliction, which you can't tell people about. Books so special and rare, and yours, that advertising your affection feels like a betrayal." And like a betrayal, kind of like a secret, something you would keep to yourself and, not betray somebody else's trust. It wasn't even that the book was so good or anything. It was just that the author, Peter Van Houten, seemed to understand me in weird and impossible ways. An Imperial Affliction was my book, and the way my body was my body, and my thoughts were my thoughts. Even so, I told Augustus, "My favorite book is probably An Imperial Affliction," I said. And so, when being asked about her favorite book, she uses probably because she don't want to commit fully to it, because she still kind of wants to hold on to it. "Does it feature zombies?" he asked. "No," I said. "Stormtroopers?" I shook my head. "It's not that kind of book." He smiled. "I'm going to read this terrible book with the boring title that does not contain stormtroopers," he promised. And I immediately felt like I shouldn't have told him about it. And this goes back to her kind of thoughts, that sci-fi versus literature, kind of like her book, and she didn't want to share it. Augustus spun around to a stack of books beneath his bedside table. He grabbed a paperback and a pen. As he scribbled an inscription onto the title page, he said, "All I ask in exchange is that you read this brilliant and haunting novelization of my favorite video game." He held up the book, which was called The Price of Dawn, I laughed and took it. Our hands kind of got muddled together in the cold book handoff, and then he was holding my hand. Cold, he said, pressing a finger to my pale wrist. Not cold so much as under-oxygenated, I said. I love it when you talk medical to me, he said. He stood and pulled me up with him, and did not let go of my hand until we reached the stairs. Alright, so that's where it has a natural cutoff point, but you can see between this like kind of mutual flirting that the way things are going, and understanding like their motivations. And the one thing about like him scribbling in the book is that there's a funny part at the end where he goes, she's actually dropping him off now because he has a prosthetic leg. His leg was cut off because he had cancer. And so he drove to their house, but he's driving back to her house, and she decides to drive. So he's in the passenger seat, and he's talking to her. He's like, "May I see you again?" he asked. There was an endearing nervousness in his voice. I smiled. "Sure. Tomorrow?" he asked. "Patience, grasshopper," I counseled. "You don't want to seem overeager." "Right. That's why I said tomorrow," he said. "I want to see you again tonight,